Hello everyone, Sam here, and I am happy to announce that I am starting my first BookTube reading event. And the name of this event is Mummy May. Uh, as the name implies, it's going to be about mummies. That's why I got my explorer's hat on, because if we're going to be going into the Egyptian desert, we're going to need a nice hat to protect us from the sun. This is going to be, as I said, my first BookTube reading event. When I first joined BookTube, I was kind of under the impression that there was like a process for getting your book event started. I thought, oh, well, you gotta, do this and do that, do some networking and do it, just some sort of process and formula you had to do in order to start one. But I've kind of learned from other booktubers that I've been following that no, you can just start one. You can start one and throw it out into the wild and see if anybody else wants to do it. I'm hoping other people will join me in this reading event, but I hope, but we shall see. At this moment, I only have 7 followers, but I do have a couple of connections to some other booktubers, so hopefully I can get a little bit of stuff going with this event. I was kind of inspired by 2 booktubers for this. The first was Randy Ray. Randy Ray did the Haggard January event earlier this year, and that was quite a lot of fun. It exposed me to H. Rider Haggard and got me into a couple of cool stories. So Randy Ray was the one who kind of got me started thinking, oh well, I should probably try and do my own event, something I'm interested in. The second person was Michael K. Vaughan, because Michael K. Vaughan has done a couple of monster-related videos. He did one about Dracula. He did one about the 1970s Marvel horror comics. And, of course, he has his co-host Roger, who is a mummy. But it actually was not Roger who inspired this event. That actually goes back to before I really became a booktuber, or even really was thinking about booktube. This was inspired by a man named Jim Beard. And I met Jim Beard at Pulp Fest last year. It was up in the Pittsburgh area. And Jim Beard had a publishing house called Flinch Books. And they were actually celebrating their 10th year of existence at last year's Pulp Fest. They had a whole panel about it. And Jim Beard co-runs that Flinch Books with, let me make sure I get his name right, John C. Bruening. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And they were both there at Pulp Fest in the vendors hall selling their Flinch books. And I bought a fair number of them. They looked pretty interesting. They had some character books who were original characters. I wasn't as interested in them as I was the anthologies they did, because they had anthologies for different topics. One was like a Wild West anthology. Another one was an anthology devoted to the characters of Fletcher Hanks, the infamous comic book creator who did a lot of weird comic characters like Stardust and Phantoma. But the other one that they had is actually the one I have right here, titled Restless, an anthology of mummy horror. And this was one of the first books they did. I don't think it was the first, but it was one of the first, because this was released. When was this released? 2017. 2017. They were started in 2016. So this was a pretty early book of theirs. And I was talking to Jim Beard at Pulp Fest about Restless, and we got to talking about how there was kind of a lack of mummy fiction, particularly compared to other horror monsters like ghosts, vampires, werewolves, zombies. Like all those guys, they had tons of movies or shows or anthology collections, video games. They just had a lot of stuff. But Mummies, Jim Beard told me, didn't really have the same vibe. They didn't have the same success as those other supernatural creatures in fiction. Because they were just... In some ways they were kind of too niche, or in some ways they were kind of similar to other ones, particularly zombies. There was kind of this overlap with that, and it was kind of just this perception that mummies were like heavily fixated on one culture, that being Egypt. So Jim Beard had told me that, yeah, he kind of wanted to do mummy fiction for Restless, or at least curate. He doesn't write any stories for this, but he curated them. And he just really wanted to give mummies their due. And that was his main point with Restless. You know, try to spark a little interest in mummies as a monster, and just get people interested in them. And that kind of got me thinking over the last couple months, and just sort of going, oh yeah, I kind of thought more about mummies, and sort of thought about what they did, what their place was in fiction. And one of the things that I did is I was kind of looking into the history of mummies, was that mummies kind of go through phases, because they follow fascinations with Egyptian culture, because ancient Egypt is a very big obsession throughout Western civilization. It's kind of up there with ancient Greece. Europe and United States, Canada, Australia, all that. The Western world has this long-standing obsession with Egyptology, and this isn't a thing that like happened like within the last 100 years. It's been something that's been off and on for several hundred years, because after all, Egyptian civilization is thousands of years old. And so as the Enlightenment kind of came around in the 1700s, we kind of had this like, oh, these ancient civilizations, there were these deep fascinations with ancient civilizations, and Egypt was one of them. And the thing I learned was that there's always these brief, like 10-year period or so crazes of Egyptology. Everyone gets Egypt mania, essentially. And it's been off and on, not just through the decades, but through the centuries. Like, it's been a big fascination in the Western world. And that's kind of not the case with a lot of the other creatures like ghosts and vampires and whatnot. They usually have a fairly consistent presence throughout fiction, throughout all these years. But mummies just don't seem to have that. They seem to ebb and flow depending on what the current taste of modern culture is, when people start getting back into Egyptology. And one of the things that I learned looking up, Jim Beard mentions it in the prologue for Restless, that there are actually mummies all over the world. Not just Egypt. There have been recorded mummies in South America, other places in Asia. So it's not a purely Egyptian thing, but and but mummies have kind of been associated with Egypt. It's very much kind of become, oh, a mummy is from Egypt. That's the perception. And the funny thing is, a lot of those monsters I mentioned, like vampires, werewolves, zombies, they all came from specific places too. Like vampires had a very, at least a Western conception of a vampire had a strong tie to Eastern Europe. Werewolves kind of had a strong tie to Western Europe. Zombies were from Haiti. But all of them kind of, even though they are still heavily associated with those places, they kind of broke out. Like, you could have a vampire or a werewolf or a zombie not from those places, and people would accept it. But mummies kind of had a problem with that. They couldn't really break out of that element, or out of that perception, even though they did exist in different places. And that was, again, Jim Beard mentions that's why he wanted to do Restless, to kind of examine that. So that whole conversation with Jim Beard had kind of been sticking in my head for a while. And I decided that I kind of finally decided on it because about 2 months ago I came across TV tropes. And I've been off and on TV tropes for a couple of years, but one of the articles they had that I found that was really interesting, they list the different tropes of media. And one of the tropes they listed was called the seductive mummy. I think it may just be called seductive mummy. And the whole idea of it was that there was a tendency, and it discusses this in the article, where mummies for a long time were not portrayed as like the dusty, shambling, bandage monsters we think of them as today, but they were actually portrayed as like beautiful. They were portrayed as like these beautiful beings who emanated power and were like very attractive. And that was kind of playing into the Egypt mania I talked about earlier, where these writers were kind of taking the romantic idea of Egypt and basically putting it onto the mummy. So that was kind of an interesting article, and that got me thinking about doing this. But the thing that really kind of kicked me in the butt for this was that last week we actually had a release of a major mummy movie, that being Lee Cronin's The Mummy. This is part of an attempt Universal has been doing to like reinvigorate their Universal monsters. They've been giving the different monsters to different directors to see what they can make of it. They tried to do like a cinematic universe a few years ago. I think it was with Tom Cruise. In fact, that was almost a decade ago, I think. But that didn't really pan out, so they've been doing these individual movies for, like, I think there was one with the Invisible Man, also the Wolf Man. But Lee Cronin's addition to that series was The Mummy, and that was released last week, and it's in the same thing as the Boris Karloff Mummy, as well as the Brendan Fraser Mummy. And it's more of a darksome take on it, going back to the Boris Karloff version. So I saw the news about that releasing. I went, okay, I need to buckle down and start this event. And I also found it fortuitous because Mummy and May work really well, because both start with an M and end with a Y. So it was a fitting thing. May tends to be a pretty warm month, much like how it's warm in Egypt. So I just kind of went, yeah, now is the time. It's been bouncing around my head for a while, so might as well jump to it. So, yeah, I'm hoping that reading some of these mummy stories will convince both myself and all of you watching that the mummy deserves a bit of a comeback, and maybe an extension of the mummy mythos that the mummy has not gotten compared to these other supernatural monsters. So I'm following Jim Beard's lead, and Jim Beard, if you're watching, I hope you are happy about me trying to promote the mummy. So thank you to Jim Beard for the major inspiration for this event. So yeah, that's the reason I'm doing this, and let's see if we can get some motion for the mummy. So the actual event is very simple. It examines mummy stories, and it's working to highlight their importance as horror icons. There is only one requirement for this event, and it's that you must read 4 books related to mummies. They can be novels, they can be short story collections, and they can be nonfiction. Those 3 things, but they have to be focused on mummies, primarily focused on mummies. Now, it can be any kind of mummy. Like I said, we're trying to break them out of the Egyptian sandbox, so as to say. But Egyptian mummies are fine too. So it can be any kind of mummy. But the one rule is that it has to be a lengthy enough work, and it has to be centrally focused on a mummy through the story or the series of stories. Now, I'll also provide an out if, for some of you, if you maybe don't have the time to do full-length stories about mummies. I'm going to give you the option. You can also do 4 short stories about mummies, because it's actually easier to find short stories regarding mummies in isolation than it is to find full-on collection of books that are just short story collections that are just mummy stories. Like, there's surprisingly not as many as you'd think, which, again, another reason to do this event, get the word out about mummies. I'm going to leave a link in the description to a website that actually lists a fair number of mummy stories. I actually found some of the stories I'll be doing for this event on that website. I will leave it in the description, so if anybody wants to join in, they can go and check that website out and see if they can find any stories they're into. And this lasts throughout all of May. So you will have time to read a fair amount of this, of these works. So May is for mummies. You can read all May. You can start before May. That's what I'm going to do. But like I said, it can either be 4 full-length works about mummies or 4 short stories about mummies, whichever one's easier for you. But they do have to be centrally focused on mummies. Like, it can't just be a mummy is like in the background. It has to be, the mummy has to be the focus of the story. So that's full-length works, which include novels, short story collections, non-fiction stories. It could be biographies about a mummy, or just a biography about mummies. Those 3 things count as full-length works. Or you could do the 4 short stories, taking short stories from wherever to that focus on mummies. So that's the only rule, is that it's mummy may, so it has to be mummies. Whether you do 4 full-length works or 4 short stories. So that's the important rule to remember, and yeah, that's the only real main rule for this event. Because like I said, it's about the mummies. So the first book that I'm going to read, I'm doing 4 full-length works because I like to challenge myself. The first one is going to be the one that I mentioned beforehand by Jim Beard and John C. Bruening, Restless, an anthology of mummy horror. Especially since this is the book that really inspired this event. So, and also because I want Jim Beard and John C. Bruening to know that their work is promoting interest in mummies. So I really want to do this to help them out in that regard. And the whole, like I said earlier, the whole premise of this story is that it does have Egyptian mummies, but it also goes to other places around the world. So it focuses on mummies beyond Egypt. Like, I think one in here is Mongolia. Yeah, one's Mongolia. One's Siberian. Another one is actually Mexican. So it's going to a lot of different places. And I'm really curious to see how each of the authors approaches the idea, because especially the ones that are not set in Egypt, because there could be some interesting takes that they do on mummies, and not necessarily have to be beholden to the customs and tropes of the typical Egyptian mummy. So this will be very interesting to read, and I'm really looking forward to that. The second story is going to be by an author I've discovered over the last month or so. She Who Sleeps by Sax Rohmer. Now, if the name Sax Rohmer sounds familiar, it's because Sax Rohmer was the author of the Fu Manchu stories, and I've actually read the first 2 over the last month. There'll be some Fu Manchu episodes up in the near future. But Sax Rohmer had a very deep obsession with the occult. He actually wrote a book about the occult. It was one of his earliest books, a non-fiction book. And he was also very obsessed with Egypt, because Egypt is a very commonly reoccurring thing in many of his novels and some of his short story collections. Because apparently he visited the country many times. He was very obsessed with it. He had a lot of Egypt mania, you might say. So a lot of his stories did revolve around the country. Even his the important character Karamina from the Fu Manchu series, she was Egyptian. So he was very fascinated with Egypt, and She Who Sleeps invokes that Egyptian element too. And the essential story about this is that it focuses on this American playboy who is in America. He's driving around New York City, and all of a sudden he sees the image of this beautiful woman, presumably one like this cover here. But he has this vision, and all of a sudden, but while he has the vision, he gets in a car crash. And, you know, he's fine. He recovers just fine from the car crash, but he's very confused about this strange woman that appeared to him. Well, a couple of weeks later, his father, who's an Egyptologist, learns of this papyrus scroll one of his comrades has found. And the scroll shows the location of a buried pharaoh princess from thousands of years ago. She was part of some of the royal pharaohs from thousands of years ago. So that's very cool. But it also shows an image, a supposed image of the woman who was buried. And this playboy happens to take a look at it, and he's shocked because the princess on the papyrus is the same image of the woman he saw right before the car crash. So, and not just that, but the papyrus insists that the princess is still alive. It's not just she was buried alive or anything like that, but that whatever process that was used on her has actually just put her in suspended animation. She's not dead. So the playboy and his father go on this expedition to find she who sleeps. So that's a very interesting premise. That definitely caught my eye. And somebody on the some review site said it was described as a romance hiding as a horror. So I was kind of curious about that, and this is one of those stories that kind of emphasizes the sort of romantic angle of mummies, because particularly with Egyptian mummies, they were like that TV Tropes article said, there was like this heavy association with the romance of Egypt. So this story seems to lean into that concept, so I'm really curious to see how that's done. And I also just really wanted to see some of Sax Rohmer's non-Fu Manchu stuff, because Fu Manchu is mostly what he's known for, but he did do a whole lot of other stories. And I'm going to be reading it from the Starkhouse edition, because I bought a couple of Starkhouse books and they're pretty good. And this is actually a double Rohmer. She Who Sleeps is the first book. The second one is one called Moon of Madness. Moon of Madness is more of a thriller than a horror romance, but that's not. But I'm not going to read it for this event because it has nothing to do with mummies, supposedly. So, She Who Sleeps. We're going to check it out, see how it is. Now, book 3 is an interesting one. I had to shuffle through some places to find it. It is titled The Mummy Walks Among Us. And it doesn't have an author name. It says edited by Vic Ghidalia. And this is a collection of classic pulp stories featuring mummies. It was an old book. It says it was put out by Xerox, like the Xerox, the company that made the Xerox machine, I believe. And apparently there's other anthologies about other like sort of horror creatures. But all of the it's not said in this book. I had to look it up on some blog sites, but the stories in here are all by writers who wrote for the classic pulp magazine Weird Tales. Like they all wrote for Weird Tales. All the folks in this book. There is one or two stories here that are not from Weird Tales. But the rest of them are. So this is essentially a Weird Tales collection. So that's a very exciting thing for me, because I'm always fascinated by classic pulp fiction. And I kind of want to check this out just for historical sake to see how pulp writers sort of approach the mummy concept. Particularly if they wrote them around the time that the Boris Karloff mummy came out, and want to see how much they play into that sort of image of the mummy. So that'll be very interesting to check out. The fourth book I'm going to do I do not have a physical copy of it, but I can very easily get it on Project Gutenberg because it's in the public domain. And it's a book some of you might be familiar with because it is fairly well known. It is The Jewel of the Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker is, of course, the famous writer of Dracula, and Dracula is his most well-known creation. But this was another story he wrote that was a horror tale that was published in 1904, several years after Dracula. And it's actually, looking around, it seems like this was probably his second most well-known book, because, well, it's another horror book, so of course Bram Stoker and horror go together like peanut butter and jelly. But obviously it's not as big as Dracula. But because what is? Like, Dracula himself is so huge that it's kind of hard to... it does not surprise me that Bram Stoker could not make a character bigger than that, because sometimes you make a character too big. So it's kind of fitting that we were talking earlier about how vampires overshadowed mummies. Well, even Bram Stoker, who popularized the vampire, couldn't quite make the mummy as ubiquitous. So, and this story, Jewel of the Seven Stars, is a story about an archaeologist who is trying to resurrect the mummified remains of a queen. And so a queen named Terra, I believe, and she was an ancient pharaoh of Egypt, and so the story's about him trying to resurrect her. That's the baseline that I know. I didn't want to learn too much about it because I haven't read it, and since it's a fairly well-examined story, I was kind of like, well, I don't want the twist to be ruined for me. Excuse me. Out of all these stories, this is probably the one that has the most artistic credence. Probably because it was written by Stoker, and such a huge person and writer like that is going to get a fair amount of attention. But even just going over like some of the Google searches I did, hearing what people thought about Jewel of the Seven Stars, there was a lot of scholarly attention to it. Like, there was stuff talking about how maybe it's a commentary on like colonialism. There was some talking about how it was like looking at it from like a feminist angle. So there were a lot of different perspectives done on it, and that was just me looking from a brief internet search. So that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of going into it like, oh, I wonder what this is gonna be like. I was hoping to finish reading Dracula before this story, but I'm probably gonna finish Jewel of the Seven Stars before this, just because I really want to get this one done before May, and you know, Dracula can be done at any time. So like I said, I'm going to be doing this via ebook, since this is readily available online, multiple sources. It's out of copyright. I'm going to be reading the Project Gutenberg version, but you can find it tons of other places, so it's not a hard story to find. If I really wanted, I could probably go to my library and find an edition. In fact, maybe I will do that if I want a physical book, but for now I'll stick with Gutenberg and work from there. Now, I said going in that I was going to do 4 full-length works, and I was going to leave it there. But I decided to be an example to all of you. I was going to demonstrate doing how to do 4 short works. And my idea was I was going to do 4 short stories along with these ones. You guys don't have to do them. You can do either the 4 full-length or the 4 short stories for Mummies. But I was going to do 4 full-length works and 4 short stories because I really wanted to be an example and show everyone stories that you could examine if you really wanted to do the short story version of this I say contest, it's a reading event. So I'm going to briefly go over 4 short stories that I'm going to read for this event to maybe give you guys some ideas about mummy stories that you could check out. First one is going to come from one of the most famous writers of all time, Edgar Allan Poe. This is my big Edgar Allan Poe collection. It has all of his short stories and his novel, his one novel he did. It says complete tales and poems. There's a couple of poems that aren't in this. So I've had this for over a decade. It's a very cool book, and it contains the story that I'm going to read for my bonus stories. I'm going to call these 4 short stories my bonus stories. And the one by Poe is titled Some Words with a Mummy. This was one of Poe's later stories. It was published in 1845, 4 years before his death. And according to everything I read, it's one of the earliest depictions of a revived mummy in fiction. Some people have said the first, others have said, well, it's not the first, but it is like a really early example. So I can definitively say it's one of the first. So good old Poe coming through on a horror monster. That's fitting, considering how influential Poe is on horror. And the whole point of the story is that a unnamed narrator gets invited to an unwrapping of a mummy, but it's not just an unwrapping. They're hoping to revive the mummy. And if he is revived, they want to interview him to learn what life was like in ancient Egypt. Now, the one weird thing about this story that a lot of sources I read said is that it's much more of a satire than it is a horror, which might seem a little strange to some people because Poe was most heavily associated with horror. But Poe actually did do a whole lot of other genres. Satire was probably one of the biggest ones he did, but he also dabbled in science fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction. What was the other one? He did political satire. So he actually had a much wider range of writings than a lot of people gave him credit with. In fact, reviewing this story is going to be my excuse to start my Edgar Allan Poe series where I examine a lot of his works. So that's one reason I want to do this. So this will be interesting how a writer who's more associated with horror kind of tackles the mummy in more of a satirical way. So that's going to be real interesting to read. The second bonus story I'm going to read is titled The Unseen Man's Story. This was by an author named Julian Hawthorne. Julian Hawthorne was the son of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is a very famous American writer. You've probably read some of his stories at some point in school. But Julian was a writer himself. In fact, the publishing house Cersova magazine, their Cersova publishing line, they actually did a brief line where they reprinted a lot of Julian Hawthorne's pulp works, like The Cosmic Courtship, Sarah was Judith, like all these Hawthorne stories. I'm going to leave a link to the description because they're very good editions. I highly recommend them, and you can check those out. But the Unseen Man story was part of a short story collection done by Hawthorne titled 6 Cent Sam's. And there's two sections of the book. One has this collection of general short stories, you know, the stuff you just put into a regular short story collection. But then the second half has this grouping of stories called the Symposium. And what the Symposium is that the titular Sam, 6 Cent Sam, hosts a Christmas dinner that he invites the narrator and a bunch of other people he knows to. And at the Christmas dinner, he invites the guests to tell their various stories. And they range from like comedies to tragedies, everything in between. And they're all titled by the person telling the story. For instance, there's an author who tells a story, it's called the author's story. There's a captain who tells a story, it's called the captain's story. And this story is by the Unseen Man. And he's called that because the narrator never really got a good look at him during the Christmas dinner. So the titular Unseen Man describes a story where he's in Egypt and he falls in love with a resurrected Egyptian queen. And that's the premise of the story. I have no clue how it turns out. I only read the first bit. But that was an interesting thing, and I was kind of interested in seeing how Julian Hawthorne wrote that specific tale. So I was really curious about that. Especially Hawthorne himself had a very interesting output. So that'll be cool to check out. The third bonus story, got to give credit to Randy Ray for this one because it's an H. Rider Haggard story titled Smith and the Pharaohs. This was a short story that I was interested in because when I was starting this event, I decided to go, you know what, since I was reading Haggard earlier this year, let me go through see if H. Rider Haggard did any mummy stories, because he was really, there was a point in Haggard's career where he got really obsessed with far-off places, and I was kind of thinking, well, I wonder if he had a mummy story, because he was very obsessed with visiting far-off places. And this one popped up on the examples on lists of mummy stories that I was looking for. And it was serialized from 1912 to 1913. It was later published in a story collection titled Smith and the Pharaohs and Other Tales. So the story deals with the titular Smith, who goes to a museum that has like all these Egyptian artifacts, and he sees this sculpture of Mami, the Egyptian queen. And it's Mami, M-A-M-E-E, not Mommy. It's Mami. But he goes to the museum, he sees this sculpture of her, and he becomes smitten with her. And then the sculpture seems to come to life. And the point of the story that a lot of people have told me on internet is that it's debating, well, is he going insane? Like, through his desire for this woman from far off ancient history, he's going insane and like making the sculpture come to life? Or is she really coming back to life purely for his love of her? So, again, kind of playing into that romance of Egypt theme that a lot of these earlier mummy stories had. So, I was really curious about that. I'd like to see how this story ends up. The fourth story is going to be a shameless plug because I've mentioned it in another episode, but I run a podcast called the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast, and it is a podcast focused on the pulp heroine, the Domino Lady, who was this very niche, not really well-known pulp heroine who started getting this comeback in the late 2000s and now has kind of a cult following among the pulp fandom, myself included. And my Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast focuses on her. And interestingly enough, she actually has a story involving a mummy, creatively titled Domino Lady versus Mummy. It's kind of hard to do with the light I have here, but the Domino Lady is this woman with the gun and wearing the mask and dress, and this is the mummy. So this was part of a line of comics and stories that was done by Moonstone Books. Moonstone Books has put out a lot of Domino Lady content, and this was part of an event. On the top here, it's kind of hard to see with my camera, but it says Return of the Originals, and the Originals is scratched out with monsters. Return of the Originals was a thing where Moonstone was trying to promote old pulp heroes in their works, and Return of the Monsters was a short series involved in that, where the different pulp heroes fought monsters that were they weren't explicitly supposed to be the universal monsters, but there was a very heavy hints they were supposed to be. There were some, obviously, Moonstone was not contracted by Universal to do these stories, so they can't explicitly say, oh, it's like the Wolfman or the Mummy, because remember, it's Domino Lady versus Mummy, not the Mummy. But it was an interesting series. They had this one, Domino Lady versus Mummy. They had one where I believe it was the spider fighting a werewolf, the Phantom Detective fighting Frankenstein. So it was an interesting little series, and this was the Domino Lady's contribution to said series. And in this story, the Domino Lady investigates a series of ritualistic murders that have an Egyptian tie, and they may actually be connected to a long-dead mummy. So, and this was actually a reoccurring theme. There was another comic book where the Domino Lady teamed up with Sherlock Holmes to fight this Pharaoh cult in Egypt. So it's a weirdly reoccurring theme with the Domino Lady, but yeah, it's I can see why, because the Domino Lady is kind of a provocative heroine, so that element of romantic attraction that a lot of authors imbued with the Mummy kind of fits for this kind of character. So I'm definitely really interested to see how this takes the Mummy concept. So that's all the stories and books that I'm going to do myself for Mummy May. And I'm now going to do, I don't know if this is considered tacky by BookTube standards, but I am going to do an open call to my fellow BookTubers who I think would probably enjoy this. Ones that I'm familiar with, a few I've had interactions with. The first one I wanted to put a call for is Michael K. Vaughan, because Mr. Vaughan is interested in pulp, which there are plenty of mummy stories involved, and of course his co-host, Roger, who is a mummy himself. So if you're paying attention, Mr. Vaughan, I highly recommend you hop in. I think you'll have a lot of fun, considering you have an an affinity for horror characters yourself. I also want to call for Randy Ray to do it because he's done a lot of BookTube events, and he has a wide breadth of reading interests, so I think he would probably like checking this out. I also want to call for a homeschool library. If you're interested, I've noticed you have kind of a wide taste of books, and you have an interest in history particularly. I actually saw I didn't see a video, but I saw a thumbnail for one of your videos that had an Egyptian image on it, so I think you would probably enjoy this too. Mummies can be very educational. I remember as a kid reading children's books that had a lot of mummy and Egyptian themes to it, so this could definitely be educational and cool to check out. And if you, yes you, are interested in Mummy May, you should definitely check this out too and find some stories you want to do for Mummy May. And I'm going to leave a link to Michael K. Vaughan, Randy Ray, and Homeschool Library in the description because they do a lot of cool videos, and even if they don't want to participate, I highly recommend you check them out because they are very good BookTube creators. So, yeah. And if you decide you want to participate in Mummy May, please let me know in the comments because I'm going to try and list every single person who's participating in either the description of the various Mummy May videos I'm making, as well as the comments. I'm going to leave a pinned comment so that everybody can find your channel easily and can find your Mummy May videos that way. So please let me know if you want to join in, because this would be a lot of fun. I really want to see different stories everybody brings in, so that maybe we can expand the pool of mummy fiction. So yeah, that's the where I'm going to close this off. Please share this event with everybody you know. If you want to participate, please mention it in the comments. I will put the link to your channel in the description and the comments, not just for this video, but every video for Mummy May, because I really want to encourage the community through this. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you guys soon, and hopefully we can have a lot of fun having mummies over for May. So, alright. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Hope to see you throughout May. Bye.